I tried to teach my grandson how to fix a bike. My daughter-in-law pulled him away and said, "He doesn't need grandpa's outdated failures." My son looked at me and said, "Let's not confuse him." I walked away. But that night, I left behind a toolbox containing more than just wrenches. Inside was a letter that would. I've always believed that the most valuable things a man can pass down aren't written in wills or locked in safes. They're quieter than that. They live in hands that know how to fix things, in patience, in the kind of lessons you don't even realize you're learning until you need them. For most of my life, I was the kind of man people called when something broke. Not because I was the cheapest, not because I was the fastest, but because I fixed things the right way. I owned a small repair shop just outside Columbus, Ohio. It wasn't much to look at: faded blue paint, a crooked sign that had been hit by a delivery truck sometime in the early 2000s, but inside everything had its place. Bikes, lawn mowers, old engines most people would have thrown away. I fixed them all. And for 38 years I built something steady, something honest. I raised my son, Daniel, in that shop. He used to sit on a wooden stool in the corner, legs swinging, asking 1,000 questions I never got tired of answering. Why does this gear slip? What happens if you tighten that too much? Why do you always clean the parts before putting them back? I never rushed him, never brushed him off. Because I knew one day those questions would turn into understanding. Or at least I thought they would. Daniel didn't stay in the shop, not really. He grew up, went to college, got a business degree, said he wanted something bigger, something modern. I told him I was proud of him, and I meant it. Even when he started talking about scaling, efficiency, and systems like they were more important than people. Even when he suggested I sell the shop and capitalize on the asset. I didn't argue, I just kept working. Because not everything needs to grow, some things just need to last. Years passed. Daniel married a woman named Clea. Clea was sharp, the kind of sharp that cuts before you realize you've been sliced. She worked in corporate consulting, always dressed perfectly, always speaking like every sentence was part of a presentation. The first time I met her, she looked around my shop like it was a museum exhibit. "Charming," she said. I couldn't tell if she meant it. They had a son 2 years later, my grandson Ethan. Now Ethan, he was different. Curious in the same way Daniel used to be. Quiet, observant, the kind of kid who didn't just play with toys, he studied them, took them apart, tried to understand them. The first time I showed him how to use a wrench, he held it like it mattered. That's when I knew. Some things skip a generation. By then I had stepped back from full-time work. My hands weren't as steady as they used to be, and the shop had a young guy running day-to-day operations. I still came in most mornings though, not to work. Just to be there. Ethan started visiting on weekends. At first it was just small things, tightening loose bolts, pumping air into tires. I'd explain what I was doing and he'd nod like he was filing it away somewhere important. Clea didn't like it. She never said it outright, not at first, but you could see it in the way she hovered, the way she'd check her watch, the way she'd wipe Ethan's hands the second he got a little grease on them. "Let's not make a mess," she'd say. Or, "That's not really useful these days, is it?" I'd just smile and keep things simple. Because this wasn't about usefulness. It was about understanding. Daniel, he stayed quiet. That was the part that bothered me the most. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't dismissive, he just didn't engage, like he'd already decided which world he belonged to, and it wasn't this one anymore. Still, he never stopped me from spending time with Ethan. Not until that afternoon. It was a warm Saturday, the kind of day where the air feels still, like it's waiting for something to happen. Ethan had brought his bike over, a small red thing with scratched paint and a loose chain. "Grandpa, it keeps slipping," he said. I knelt down beside it, turning the pedals slowly. "That's because the tension's off," I told him. "Easy fix, want to learn?" He nodded immediately. That's how it always starts. I handed him a wrench, guiding his hands, showing him where to adjust. He was focused, careful, listening. Exactly the way Daniel used to. And for a moment, it felt like nothing had changed. Then Clea's voice cut through the air. "Ethan's come here." We both looked up. She was standing a few feet away, arms crossed, expression tight. "We're leaving." Ethan hesitated, but I'm fixing my bike. You don't need to do that, she said, stepping closer. That's not something you should be learning. I frowned, wiping my hands on a cloth. It's just a basic adjustment, good for him to know. She didn't even look at me when she replied. He doesn't need Grandpa's outdated failures. The words landed harder than I expected. Outdated failures. I felt Ethan's hands go still under mine. Daniel stepped forward then, finally speaking. Let's not confuse him, he said, not meeting my eyes. Confuse him. Like understanding how things work was somehow a disadvantage. I could have argued. I could have reminded them where Daniel learned to solve problems, who taught him patience, who built everything he now stood on. But I didn't. Because there's a moment, just one, when you realize that saying something won't fix anything. So I let go of the wrench, stood up, and walked away. Behind me I heard Claire calling Ethan again. This time he went. I didn't turn around. But that night I made a decision. If they thought my lessons had no value, then I would leave behind something they couldn't ignore. Not just for Ethan, but for all of them. That night I didn't sleep. Not because of what Claire said, though her words echoed more than I cared to admit, but because of what Daniel didn't say. Silence has a way of revealing things words try to hide. I sat at the small kitchen table in my house, the same one Daniel used to do his homework on. The wood was worn smooth in places from years of use. I ran my fingers across it, remembering late nights, math problems, and the quiet satisfaction of watching him figure things out on his own. Back then, he never needed shortcuts. Now I wasn't so sure. Around midnight, I got up and drove to the shop. It wasn't unusual. I'd done it plenty of times before, restless nights leading me back to the one place that always made sense. The building stood in the dark, familiar and steady. When I unlocked the door, the scent of oil and metal greeted me like an old friend. Everything was exactly where it should be. Unlike the rest of my life. I walked past the workbench, past the rows of tools I'd collected over decades. Each one had a story, each one had earned its place. I stopped at the back office. That's where I kept the records. Not just invoices or receipts, but everything. Handwritten notes from early years, customer logs, repairs that shouldn't have worked but did, the kind of history you can't replicate with software or spreadsheets. Daniel used to laugh about it. You should digitize all this, he'd say. You're sitting on data you don't even realize has value. I always told him the same thing. I already know what matters. At the time, I thought he just didn't understand. Now I realized something else. He understood perfectly. I pulled open the filing cabinet and started going through the folders, slowly, methodically, looking for something I hadn't needed before. Proof. Because deep down, something about that afternoon didn't sit right. Claire's words weren't just dismissive, they were deliberate, too deliberate. And Daniel, he hadn't defended me, not even out of habit. That kind of shift doesn't happen overnight. It builds, quietly, over time. I reached the bottom drawer and paused. There was a folder I hadn't touched in years, not since Daniel first approached me about modernizing the business. I opened it. Inside were copies of proposals, draft agreements, emails I had printed out and set aside, more out of instinct than intention. Back then, Daniel had suggested bringing in investors, expanding the shop into a regional chain. He had numbers, projections, even a name picked out. I said no. Not because it was a bad idea, but because it wasn't mine. And I knew what would happen if I let go of control. He'd insisted it was just an option, something to consider. Eventually, he dropped it. Or at least I thought he did. As I flipped through the papers, something caught my eye. A document I didn't recognize. It was newer than the others. Printed on thicker paper, different formatting. I sat down and read it carefully. Then I read it again. Because the first time, I thought I misunderstood. It was a business registration. Not for my shop. but for a company with a name I'd never seen before. Same industry, same service model, but scaled, structured, designed to grow. At the bottom were two names, Daniel and Claire. I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not yet, just clarity. I kept digging. More documents surfaced, lease agreements for a new location, supplier contracts, equipment purchases. All dated within the last year. While they were still bringing Ethan to visit me. While Daniel still asked casual questions about how I handled certain repairs, about pricing, about customer retention. At the time, I thought he was just curious. Now I saw it differently. He wasn't asking. He was collecting. Piece by piece. Everything I'd built. And then I found the one thing that made it undeniable. A printed email thread. Daniel and Claire discussing transition strategy. Not for their business. For mine. Claire's words were precise. If we position it correctly, we can absorb his client base within 6 months. Most of them are loyal to the service, not him personally. Daniel's reply came hours later. He won't agree to sell. Claire responded almost immediately. He doesn't need to. Once we're operational at scale, he becomes irrelevant. I leaned back in the chair, the paper still in my hands. Irrelevant. That's what they thought. Not outdated. Not old-fashioned. Replaceable. I looked around the office, the walls, the cabinets, the desk I'd sat at for decades. This wasn't just a shop. It was a life's work. And they had already decided how it would end. Without me. I should have felt blindsided. But the truth is there were signs. Small ones. The way Claire always asked about my busiest seasons. The way Daniel started recommending I take it easy more often. Even the way they encouraged Ethan to spend less time at the shop recently. They weren't just distancing him from me. They were preparing him for a world where I didn't matter. I folded the document carefully and placed it back in the folder. Then I closed the drawer. For a long moment I just sat there, listening to the quiet hum of the old fluorescent lights. Thinking, because betrayal like that, it doesn't demand a reaction. It demands a response. And there's a difference. Anyone can react. But a response, a real one, takes time. Precision. Understanding. I stood up and walked back into the main shop. The tools hung where they always had. Wrenches, screwdrivers, gauges, all arranged in a way that made sense only if you'd spent years using them. To someone like Claire, they probably looked like clutter. To me, they were a system. Every piece had a purpose. Every tool did exactly what it was designed to do. And suddenly, I realized something. I had been looking at this all wrong. This wasn't about them taking something from me. It was about them underestimating what they were dealing with. Because they thought this was just a business. They thought it could be replicated. Scaled. Replaced. They didn't understand the one thing that made it all work. And that was their mistake. I walked over to the workbench and picked up a small, worn wrench, the same one I'd handed Ethan earlier that day. It fit perfectly in my hand. Familiar. Reliable. I turned it slowly, feeling the weight of it. Then I set it down. Carefully. Because for the first time in a long while, I wasn't thinking about fixing something. I was thinking about dismantling it. Piece by piece. Without them realizing it. Until it was too late. The next morning I didn't go to the shop, not at first. I stayed home, sitting at my kitchen table, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of cars passing on the street outside. The world carried on as if nothing had shifted, as if betrayal didn't settle like a weight in your chest, but I knew better. I felt the absence of trust, the fracture in my own family, as if it had split the air around me. Ethan came over that afternoon as usual. He didn't know what I had discovered the night before, and for now that was enough. His bike still needed attention. His eyes were bright with that same curiosity I remembered from Daniel's childhood. He was eager, asking questions about gears, chains, and brakes. I could see Claire's influence in the way he hesitated when I corrected him, almost subconsciously, as if unsure which lessons mattered, but he was still listening. I decided to focus on him. For now, Ethan was the only link to the old world, the world I'd built with my hands, not with spreadsheets and projections. I showed him how to properly adjust the derailleur on his bike, demonstrating slowly, explaining why tension mattered. His small fingers fumbled at first, but he persisted. I could see the spark of understanding begin to take root, the same spark I had seen in Daniel years ago. Then came the phone call from Daniel. "Dad, Claire and I need to talk," he said, voice tight, careful. I could hear the effort to sound casual, to make it sound normal, but I wasn't fooled. His voice betrayed a combination of fear and arrogance. He assumed I didn't know. He assumed he could control the conversation. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in front of me. "I know," I said quietly. A pause on the line, then, you know about the company." "I know everything," I said, "and I know what you and Claire are planning." Daniel's laugh was sharp, brittle. "Come on, Dad, it's just business. You're taking this too personally." "Business?" I repeated, my voice low. "You're trying to make me irrelevant in front of my grandson. That's not business, that's betrayal." He tried to argue, to justify, but the words felt hollow, like they had been rehearsed. I didn't interrupt. I let him fill the silence with his own arrogance. Eventually he hung up. I spent the rest of the day preparing. Not for confrontation. Not yet. But for something else. Something far more deliberate. I went back to the shop that evening, entering through the side door. The moonlight streamed through the high windows, casting pale patterns on the concrete floor. Everything smelled familiar, the oil, the metal, the faint scent of old wood. I walked past the workbench and ran my hands over the tools. Each one felt like an extension of my memory, my experience, my history. Each one was a piece of the life Daniel and Claire were trying to erase. I opened the cabinet where I kept my personal tools, the ones I didn't lend out, the ones I reserved for serious repairs. In a cardboard box at the bottom, I placed a small stack of envelopes. I wrote carefully, deliberately, one for Ethan, one for the shop employees, one for Daniel and Claire, and one for myself as a record, a blueprint of what was coming. The letter for Ethan was simple, short enough for him to understand one day, long enough for him to carry meaning. I explained the importance of patience, observation, and integrity. I explained that some lessons couldn't be learned in a classroom or online, that understanding comes from doing, from touching, from trying and failing and trying again. I emphasized that his grandpa's outdated failures were not failures at all. They were lessons carefully learned, and now his inheritance. Letters for Daniel and Claire were different. They were not angry. They did not accuse. They simply laid out evidence. Every contract, every email, every decision they'd made to marginalize me. But they were more than evidence. They were a mirror. The letters showed them exactly what they had done and what they had underestimated. I made no threats. I made no promises. I simply illuminated the truth of their arrogance and the gap in their understanding. The tools weren't just tools anymore. They were symbols. Every wrench, every screwdriver, every piece of machinery represented knowledge and history that couldn't be replicated by ambition alone. By the time I left the shop that night, I felt a sense of calm. I wasn't rushing into vengeance. I was planting the seeds. The world had shifted under my feet, but now I had control, not over Daniel or Claire, but over the knowledge and the legacy that mattered most. What happened next was subtle, almost imperceptible. Daniel began to notice small changes in his business operations, minor delays, suppliers being unresponsive. Claire grew frustrated with employees who didn't follow her instructions as quickly as expected. I watched from the edges, patient, careful. I didn't interfere directly. I didn't need to. The first domino had been set in motion, and it would topple in due time. But the hardest part, far harder than knowing what they'd done, was watching Ethan. I wanted him to grow without bitterness. I wanted him to see his family clearly without losing love. Every time I glanced at him, I reminded myself, the revenge was not for anger. It was for justice and the story he would inherit, the lesson he would learn. And in the quiet of that night, as I locked the shop for the 100th time, I smiled softly. Betrayal had arrived, and with it, the chance to turn the tide. The days that followed were a quiet reckoning. I returned to my routine, tending to minor repairs, helping Ethan when he came over, answering calls from loyal customers who trusted the shop because they knew me, not because of a flashy logo or digital marketing strategy. But behind that ordinary rhythm, my mind was busy, building a plan that would unfold with precision. I wasn't angry in the frantic sense, anger clouds judgment, but I was acutely aware. I was awake now, seeing the world in terms of leverage, timing, and inevitability. It began with observation. I watched Daniel and Claire closely, noting patterns, habits, and assumptions. They didn't know that I knew the full extent of their plan, and that ignorance was their greatest weakness. Daniel had always been proud of his efficiency and foresight. He believed he could predict outcomes and manipulate situations with numbers and schedules. Claire relied on precision and control, always confident that she could bend people to her will with logic and charm. Both of them underestimated what could not be quantified, the subtle web of influence, trust, and history that I had woven over decades. I started small. I quietly strengthened my bonds with the employees who remained loyal to the shop, people who had worked under me for years and trusted my judgment. I didn't tell them anything about Daniel or Claire. I simply reminded them of what the shop had always been, a place where expertise mattered more than hierarchy, where integrity was its own currency. I left hints, small signs that their efforts mattered and that their contributions were not disposable. In time, their loyalty became a silent network, eyes and ears attuned to subtle disruptions that I could now leverage. Meanwhile, I refocused on Ethan. Claire had tried to shape him into someone who admired efficiency over understanding, someone who valued results without grasping the methods. I refused to let that happen. I encouraged him to tinker, to experiment, to fail and try again. Every loose chain, every misaligned gear, every stubborn bolt became a lesson in patience, problem-solving, and perseverance. He began to approach challenges with a quiet confidence that was terrifyingly familiar. One evening, as he fixed a stubborn brake lever that wouldn't budge, I looked at him and saw the reflection of my own younger self, the part of me that had once spent hours in the glow of a shop lamp, stubbornly solving problems until success came. But the true awakening wasn't just in observation or patience. It came when I realized that I didn't need to confront Daniel and Claire head-on. Their arrogance, their underestimation, and their hunger to replace me had already created cracks in their own structure. They were overreaching, moving too quickly, and assuming compliance that would never come naturally. I had all the time I needed. Revenge, I understood now, wasn't about a single dramatic strike. It was about shaping circumstances so carefully that the outcome became inevitable, like a machine constructed to self-correct toward the desired result. I also began leaving subtle markers in the shop, a toolbox here, a labeled set of wrenches there, documents slightly repositioned. Nothing overt, nothing that screamed for attention, but everything precise. I knew that Daniel and Claire were opportunistic. They would eventually notice. They would assume they understood the patterns, and that assumption would be their first mistake. At night I wrote, not angry letters or confrontational notes, but clear, deliberate accounts of events, instructions, and the knowledge I wanted Ethan to inherit. Each page became a seed for future revelation. Every letter, every diagram, every small lesson was carefully crafted to outlast the impatience and arrogance of my son and his wife. One letter in particular I wrote slowly, almost meditatively. It was addressed to Daniel and Claire, though they would not read it for months. It was not a threat, but a mirror, showing them the gaps in their understanding, the overconfidence that had guided their choices, and the inevitability of oversight when one assumes legacy can be bought or stolen. I also revisited old clients, reconnecting, ensuring they were engaged not by loyalty alone but by trust and experience. Simple acts, remembering preferences, small corrections that demonstrated knowledge, strengthened my position quietly, invisibly. Daniel thought he could sweep in and capture the client base with promises of scale and efficiency, but what he didn't realize was that clients weren't just buying services. They were buying certainty, history, and the quiet assurance that comes from decades of reliability. That assurance could not be replicated in a fancy office or a spreadsheet. By the end of the month, I felt a calm that I hadn't known in years. The anger had subsided, replaced with focus. I wasn't plotting out of spite, I was orchestrating precision. The awakening wasn't just about revenge, it was about recognizing the depth of influence, the value of patience, and the inevitability of careful planning. Every action Daniel and Claire had taken to marginalize me had unknowingly set the stage for their undoing. And then came the moment I realized something crucial. I didn't need them to fail through confrontation or exposure. I only needed them to proceed as they always had, confident, rushed, and blind to the subtleties of the system they tried to dismantle. My plan wouldn't be flashy, it wouldn't be loud, but it would be unstoppable, patient, and utterly precise. And as I closed the shop that night, watching the moonlight trace the outlines of the tools and workbenches, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Betrayal had come, yes, but in its wake it had revealed not just weakness in them but opportunity in me. The pieces were in motion, and now I was awake, fully aware, and ready to act. I began with the toolbox. It was an ordinary box, metal, scratched from decades of use, filled with wrenches, screwdrivers, pliers, and a few precision tools that most people would have ignored. But this toolbox was more than tools, it was a vector. A way to deliver knowledge, influence, and inevitability all at once. I packed it carefully, deliberately, each item placed where it would later tell a story or reveal a lesson. At the bottom, I slipped a letter, folded so neatly it could only be discovered if handled intentionally. This letter wasn't just instructions, it was a subtle mirror for my grandson and a slow-burning trap for Daniel and Clea. I left the toolbox where Ethan could find it. Not openly, not with announcement, but in a corner of the garage they always used for storage. I called it an old grandpa thing when I saw him glance at it curiously. He didn't open it right away, but the way his fingers lingered near the latch told me all I needed to know. Curiosity had taken root. From there, I began the subtle dismantling of their plans. First, the suppliers. Daniel and Clea had assumed that their new venture would be an easy expansion, pick up the client list, move quickly, scale without friction. But every supplier they approached, every contract they attempted to secure, I quietly interfered with. Not by sabotage, not by theft, but by leveraging the trust I had spent decades building. Small suggestions here, reminders there. A late phone call from me to a supplier, casually noting how a previous contract required careful attention. A message to a delivery service about scheduling conflicts that I happened to notice. Nothing overt, but enough to create slight delays and confusion. Daniel noticed first. He called me in apparent frustration. "Dad, why are the suppliers dragging their feet? We're trying to move fast here." I smiled, keeping my tone light. "Funny you mention that. I've worked with these people for years. Sometimes a little reminder keeps everything on track." He frowned, irritated but unsure how to respond. That evening, I shifted my focus to Clea's operational plans. She had been methodical, drawing diagrams, calculating efficiency ratios, and assuming compliance from everyone around her. I introduced small disruptions, not through confrontation, but through knowledge subtly reintroduced to the system. Employees who had been loyal to me suddenly had justification to resist shortcuts or unsupervised adjustments. Miscommunications that should have been minor became visible and consequential, but only because I had framed them that way. By the time Clea noticed, the system she assumed she controlled was already responding according to my design. Meanwhile, I watched Ethan interact with the toolbox. He didn't know its full significance yet, but he began experimenting. Small repairs, misalignments corrected, and then bigger challenges. Every time he succeeded, I subtly added a new tool, a note, or a reference to an old repair method. It wasn't just about fixing a bike. It was about instilling the patience, understanding, and problem-solving skills that Clea had scoffed at. Ethan began to see patterns I hadn't even taught explicitly: mechanical reasoning, foresight, and the awareness that some solutions aren't instant, but earned. At the same time, I quietly reasserted influence over the shop's client base. I returned calls, offered small upgrades, delivered extra service with no expectation of return. Clients noticed. They remembered the decades of reliability and expertise. Daniel and Clea assumed loyalty could be bought with promises, scale, or slick branding. They underestimated history. They underestimated trust. 2 weeks into the plan, I introduced what I call the first reveal. A letter slipped to the shop employees, not accusatory, not vindictive, just factual, outlining a minor corporate misstep Daniel had made in his expansion plan. Employees, now armed with context, naturally resisted certain directives. Daniel assumed incompetence or miscommunication. He didn't realize it was me orchestrating the awareness. Every small push, every delay, every misalignment was now a predictable outcome of my careful, invisible influence. By the end of the month, Daniel and Clea were frustrated, their timelines slipping, their client acquisition slower than predicted. Their frustration grew, and with it mistakes, overconfidence now punishing them. They didn't see me, but they felt the effects. Everything they had counted on, the smooth assimilation of my shop's legacy into their plans, was no longer within their control. And then came the perfect moment. Ethan, holding the toolbox, opened the bottom compartment for the first time. Inside was the letter I had written weeks ago. He read it quietly, eyes widening as he processed the instructions, the philosophy, the subtle wisdom. He began experimenting with the tools as I had intended, not to impress, not to compete, but to learn. Every adjustment, every correction was now guided by knowledge that Daniel and Clea could neither replicate nor comprehend. The execution phase wasn't flashy. It wasn't dramatic. It was invisible, intelligent, and relentless. Every domino I had positioned in plain sight fell in sequence. By the time Daniel and Clea realized the situation had changed, it wasn't anger or confrontation that awaited them, it was inevitability. They had overestimated their control, underestimated my influence, and overlooked the most important element. Legacy cannot be replicated, bought, or replaced. I watched the pieces move like clockwork, silent and deliberate, and for the first time in months, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The betrayal had been acknowledged, the fallout initiated, and the groundwork for resolution laid. The night was still. The shop smelled of oil, metal, and faint polish. And in the corner, the toolbox waited, small, unassuming, yet containing more power than Daniel or Claire could ever understand. The first twist came unexpectedly, in a way that no plan could have predicted, though in hindsight it was inevitable. It started with Ethan. One Saturday he came over earlier than usual, a mixture of excitement and unease on his young face. I had been tinkering with an old motorbike in the corner of the shop, listening to the soft clatter of tools. Ethan approached cautiously, holding the toolbox I had left for him. His fingers lingered over the latch, hesitant. "Grandpa, I think I found something," he said quietly. I raised an eyebrow. "Found what?" He opened the bottom compartment, revealing the folded letter. I watched him read it slowly, his eyes flicking between the diagrams and instructions. Then he looked up at me, a flush on his cheeks. This is amazing," he whispered. "But it's for me, right? Not for them." I nodded. "It's for you, but what you learn can't be kept secret. Knowledge has a way of spreading if it's meant to." He hesitated, then made a choice that neither Daniel nor Claire could have anticipated. He wanted to try it on the motorbike I had been restoring, a bike that had been sitting idle for over a decade. As he worked, carefully following my guidance, a spark of ingenuity ignited, not just following instructions, but experimenting, testing tolerances, and solving problems I hadn't even explicitly explained. And then, unexpectedly, the bike roared to life. A small victory, yes, but its implications were monumental. Ethan realized something that day that even Daniel had not. Real skill isn't measured in credentials or efficiency, it's measured in understanding, patience, and adaptability. And that realization would shape the next phase of everything. The second element of the twist arrived in the form of an unforeseen ally. I had been subtly strengthening relationships with our longtime clients, but one afternoon, a retired engineer named Carl, who had been a mentor to me years ago, stopped by. "Word is there's a new company trying to muscle in on your turf," Carl said, his tone casual but sharp. "They're taking shortcuts, cutting corners, and people are noticing." I listened carefully. He had unknowingly begun a ripple that neither Daniel nor Claire could control. Customers who once might have been swayed by the promise of novelty were now questioning the speed and quality of Daniel's and Claire's operations. Carl's casual conversation had become leverage without my intervention. The final element of the twist emerged when Daniel visited the shop one evening, ostensibly to check in with me, though I suspected it was to gauge progress and reassure Claire that he hadn't lost control. He was smug at first, confident, already rehearsing his casual dominance over the situation, but he didn't realize Ethan was there, quietly observing. Ethan, now emboldened, decided to demonstrate something he had learned from the toolbox. He adjusted a chain, corrected the alignment, and solved a problem on one of the old bikes in seconds, something Daniel had struggled with before. Daniel's jaw tightened. He glanced at me, then back at Ethan. How did he? I said nothing, I just smiled faintly, letting the realization sink in. This moment changed everything. Daniel saw, perhaps for the first time, that what he thought was control was an illusion. His own son, his heir in theory, was learning from me, not from him. He had underestimated not just me, but the continuity of skill and wisdom that couldn't be bought, replaced, or scaled. Claire, as usual, didn't notice at first, but when she came to collect Ethan, her carefully rehearsed explanations and logic failed. She couldn't override what Ethan had learned, couldn't correct the practical skill he now carried. The tools, the letter, the patience, they had all taken hold. Her arrogance, her assumption that she could control outcomes through efficiency alone, was crumbling. The first twist wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no confrontation. It was subtle, elegant, and deeply effective. Daniel and Claire assumed they were ahead, operating with foresight and planning, but they were blind to the quiet education of a child, the slow realignment of clients, and the invisible leverage I had built. And the best part, they would never know the full scope until it was far too late. By the time the weekend ended, I understood the true power of the twist. Sometimes the person you underestimate, the youngest, the quietest, the seemingly weakest, can change the game entirely. And in doing so, they create an opening for the revenge you've been orchestrating. I looked at Ethan, now sitting cross-legged with his tools spread around him, eyes bright with curiosity and confidence. I realized then that he was not just the vessel for legacy, he was the first agent of its reclamation, and Daniel and Claire's arrogance had made that possible. The trap was set, the pieces were moving, and the unsuspecting players believed they were still in control. The turning point arrived not with a bang, but with an almost imperceptible shift. Daniel and Claire still believed they were in control. They continued their expansion, issuing orders, promising quick wins, and assuming that clients would switch loyalty because scale and marketing always trumped experience. But the system had already begun to turn against them, quietly, invisibly, and inevitably. It started with small misalignments in their operations. Orders were delayed, not because of incompetence, but because I had strategically positioned people who knew the history of the shop to enforce subtle resistance. A longtime supplier would insist on a compliance check that slowed delivery. An employee who had been with me for years would question a shortcut that Daniel assumed he could enforce. These weren't confrontations, they were interventions disguised as routine procedure. Daniel assumed these delays were random, mere friction of scale. Then came the client calls. Longtime customers who had trusted my judgment for decades began asking questions that Daniel and Claire could not answer convincingly. Why did the repair take longer than expected? Why did the part not meet my specifications? Each call chipped away at the facade Daniel had built, each query highlighting his inexperience and impatience. He tried to respond with promises of efficiency and modern systems, but clients could see through the gloss. They had dealt with me, they knew substance when they saw it. The turning point crystallized during a routine weekend visit with Ethan. He had become more confident with the tools and the lessons from the letter. That day he tackled a particularly stubborn bicycle chain. Claire watched, arms crossed, ready to step in and correct him if necessary. But she couldn't. Ethan had internalized the logic, the patience, the sequence of adjustments. By the time the chain clicked perfectly into place, Claire realized for the first time that her assumptions about teaching, influence, and control were fundamentally flawed. Daniel arrived shortly after, checking on the progress of what he thought was just a weekend visit. He saw Ethan, barely 8 years old, completing a repair that he himself had struggled with at that age. His face tightened as he glanced at me, and for a fleeting moment I could see panic flash in his eyes. He understood in an instant that control had shifted in ways he had not predicted. I didn't speak, I didn't need to. My silence was deliberate. Daniel tried to mask his frustration with casual conversation, but every word he spoke now carried the weight of uncertainty. He was scrambling mentally, trying to calculate, adjust, and regain the upper hand, but it was too late. The system had shifted, and he hadn't realized it until now. The real coup, however, was in how Ethan began sharing small discoveries he had made from the toolbox and letter. Simple observations, like adjusting a bolt differently or noticing wear patterns on a chain, became demonstrations of applied knowledge. Each time Daniel tried to correct or override him, he failed, not because Ethan was exceptional, but because he had learned to think, not merely follow. Claire's frustration grew visibly as she tried to enforce her efficiency-driven methods, but Ethan was operating in a framework they could not replicate. By mid-afternoon, Daniel and Claire's confidence was visibly cracking. Decisions that they had assumed were straightforward now seemed complex. Their communications with clients became defensive. Their plans faltered under scrutiny. The subtle delays and interventions I had placed weeks earlier were finally converging into undeniable momentum. Their empire, built on assumptions and ambition, began to wobble in plain sight, and yet they still believed they were managing it all. At that moment, I realized something crucial. This was not just about my revenge anymore. It was about teaching Ethan, and through him, reshaping the narrative of our family legacy. He was not just a participant, he was a conduit for the reckoning. Daniel and Claire had underestimated the most important variable in the equation: wisdom, patience, and the accumulation of skill over decades. The turning point had been reached. Daniel and Claire could still attempt to reclaim control, but their window had closed. Every action they took now was reactive, dictated by a system they no longer understood. They had assumed victory by marginalizing me, by dismissing what they called outdated failures. But in doing so, they had accelerated the exact moment where they would be exposed, not in confrontation, but through the unstoppable, quiet precision of accumulated experience. That night, I left the shop with a sense of calm satisfaction. The system had shifted, the first cracks had appeared, and the dominoes were aligned perfectly. The real power of revenge wasn't in emotion, it was in inevitability. And now Daniel and Claire were trapped, not by threats, not by force, but by the natural consequences of underestimating what they could not measure or control. The stage was set, the next steps would unfold, and they wouldn't see them coming until it was already too late. Just when I thought the course of events was predictable, the second twist arrived. It wasn't from Daniel, Claire, or even me, it came from an unexpected source: Ethan. A few days after the turning point, I had left him in the garage with the toolbox, quietly working on a vintage bicycle I'd been restoring for months. I was upstairs, finalizing a few letters that would guide the next stage of my plan, when I heard the clatter of metal and a small exclamation. I descended the stairs and found Ethan holding a small, intricately rebuilt mechanism, his eyes bright with a mixture of triumph and curiosity. "Grandpa, look, I figured it out," he said. I crouched beside him, examining the piece. It was an improvised repair he had invented himself, a small but elegant modification that made the old bike function more efficiently. He hadn't just followed the letter or my instructions. He had extrapolated, innovated, and applied his understanding in a way that neither Daniel nor Claire could have anticipated. I smiled, but inside I realized the magnitude of what had happened. Ethan wasn't just learning from the legacy I left behind, he was enhancing it. He had taken something outdated, something I had been quietly teaching him, and transformed it into something new. This was the second twist. The revenge wasn't static, it was evolving. What I had intended as a measured, precise reclamation of control had grown into something greater, a force that Daniel and Claire could not predict or counteract. They had assumed that marginalizing me would limit influence to zero. They had assumed that knowledge, skills, and legacy could be confined, but they hadn't accounted for the next generation. Later that evening, I returned to the shop and found Daniel standing near the counter, examining a client ledger. He looked up when he saw me, his expression carefully neutral, though tension lurked beneath. "Dad, we need to talk," he said, though there was no real authority in his voice. I nodded, letting him choose his words. He struggled, searching for a justification or explanation for the subtle shifts he had begun to notice. Minor delays in client orders, unexpected resistance from longtime employees, and most alarming of all, the confidence Ethan displayed during their visits. He tried to frame it as coincidence. "It's just operational hiccups," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. "Nothing serious." I let him speak, then simply gestured to the bike Ethan had been repairing. "Do you see that?" I asked. "That's not a hiccup, that's understanding." Daniel's face tightened. Claire appeared at the doorway behind him, her professional composure slightly frayed. She crossed her arms and gave me a sharp glance. "This is ridiculous," she said, though even she couldn't mask the uncertainty creeping into her tone. "He's just a child, he doesn't know what he's doing." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let Ethan demonstrate the repair once more, explaining in simple terms the reasoning behind each adjustment. The subtle genius of his actions was undeniable, a combination of knowledge inherited, observation applied, and innovation added. Daniel and Claire stood frozen, realizing for the first time that their assumptions had been flawed. They had tried to control the situation with speed, efficiency, and authority, but they had not anticipated evolution. The child they had underestimated was not just learning, he was transforming. At that moment, the second twist revealed its full power. My carefully orchestrated plan had created momentum, but now it had become self-reinforcing. Every small action, every tiny lesson, was amplified by Ethan's intelligence and initiative. The leverage I had built over decades had passed into capable hands, multiplying in ways neither Daniel nor Claire could have predicted. By the end of the evening, Daniel and Claire left the shop in tense silence. Their plans, once confidently mapped out, were now riddled with uncertainty. They assumed they could still regain control, but they could not. Not because of confrontation, not because of evidence, but because the very system they tried to dominate was now operating independently of their assumptions. I looked at Ethan as he carefully replaced each tool in the toolbox, a quiet smile playing on his lips. He didn't realize it yet, but he had become a central agent in the reversal of our family's story. And in that realization, I felt a surge of satisfaction deeper than anything I had experienced before. The pieces were not just moving, they were evolving beyond what anyone could control. And now, the real reckoning was about to begin. The reversal began subtly, almost imperceptibly, but it gathered momentum like a storm building at sea. Daniel and Claire had underestimated what they could not quantify. Decades of trust, skill, and legacy, combined with the unpredictable ingenuity of a child who had absorbed lessons faster than they realized. The world they had believed they controlled began to slip, piece by piece, under their feet. It started with the clients. I had quietly ensured that every long-term customer remained connected, not out of loyalty alone, but because they valued reliability, history, and results over slick marketing or promises of scale. When Daniel attempted to pitch his faster, more efficient services, clients instinctively compared him to what they already knew me. Subtle comments began surfacing: "The quality isn't the same," or "We've always trusted the original approach." Each remark was a nail in the coffin of Daniel and Claire's confidence. Then came the employees, those who had been loyal to me, quietly observing the subtle sabotage and delays orchestrated weeks before, began asserting influence. They did confront Daniel aggressively, but they refused to follow shortcuts or compromise standards. Minor conflicts arose, operational plans were delayed, and Daniel, who had assumed everyone would comply with his modern corporate approach, found himself constantly negotiating small resistances he didn't understand. Every disruption felt like chance, but it was entirely predictable from my perspective. The most dramatic reversal, however, came through Ethan. By now, he had internalized the lessons of patience, observation, and problem-solving. During one weekend visit, he independently fixed a faulty client order, a repair Daniel had attempted and failed to complete. When Daniel arrived to inspect, he was stunned to see his own son not only finish the task, but do so more skillfully, and with attention to detail that he himself had not yet mastered at that age. Ethan explained his reasoning calmly, methodically, using terminology Daniel had scoffed at. Daniel froze. He realized with a sinking heart that the control he had tried to exert over the shop, the legacy, and even Ethan had evaporated. He understood in that instant that he was no longer shaping events, he was being reshaped by them. The arrogance that had guided his corporate-style planning now looked naive and fragile in the light of skill, patience, and history. Claire attempted to reassert authority. She organized schedules, called meetings, and tried to push efficiency-driven methods, but each step backfired. Employees politely resisted, citing long-established practices and historical knowledge. Clients questioned procedures she insisted on, and minor failures in her operational plans compounded quickly. Her confidence, once unshakable, began cracking in visible ways. And the genius of the reversal was this: they couldn't fight it directly. Any overt attempt to reclaim control only highlighted the disparity in understanding. They had assumed they could overpower or sideline me and Ethan. They didn't realize that knowledge, when applied intelligently and patiently, creates an unstoppable cascade. Every misstep they made, every assumption they held, amplified the inevitability of their failure. By the third week, Daniel and Claire's expansion plan was in disarray. Suppliers were cautious, clients were hesitant, and employees refused shortcuts. Meanwhile, Ethan, guided by the lessons in the toolbox, continued to gain skill and confidence. I watched quietly, letting events unfold. The child they had dismissed was now a mirror of their own underestimation, reflecting back the consequences of their arrogance. Finally, Daniel called me again. His tone was hesitant, almost pleading. "Dad, something isn't working. Everything is delayed," Claire says. I interrupted gently. "Do you see now what happens when you underestimate the people who built the foundation?" He was silent, and in that silence I felt the satisfaction of inevitability. This wasn't about confrontation or anger, it was about balance restored. The system had corrected itself, not through my interference alone, but through careful planning, patient education, and the awakening of the next generation. By the end of the month, the shop was operating smoothly under my indirect guidance and Ethan's growing skill. Daniel and Claire, while still formally involved, were forced into the background. Their plans to replace or marginalize me had collapsed under the weight of their own assumptions, and they could only watch as the legacy they had tried to seize continued uninterrupted, guided not by ambition, but by understanding, history, and careful mentorship. The reversal was complete. The betrayers were sidelined. The innocent, the child, the loyal employees, and the clients who valued substance over scale had prevailed. The system that Daniel and Claire had sought to control now operated beyond their reach. And as I watched Ethan carefully organize the tools, teaching him, guiding him, I realized something profound. Revenge had not only corrected a wrong, it had created a new order, one that was smarter, subtler, and unstoppable. The stage was set for the final act. Daniel and Claire could no longer influence the outcome. The legacy was safe. And Ethan, he was ready to inherit it, fully equipped to continue what had been almost stolen from him. It was a quiet Saturday morning when I realized it was truly over. The shop smelled of oil, aged wood, and the faint tang of metal, a smell that had always grounded me. Ethan was in the corner, meticulously adjusting a chain on a restored bicycle, humming softly, completely absorbed. Daniel and Claire had come to check in, hopping, I think, to reassert some semblance of control. But when they saw him, a small, confident figure surrounded by wrenches and sprockets, something in their posture shifted. Claire's arms crossed, her professional mask still in place, but her eyes betrayed frustration. Daniel's usual smugness had disappeared, replaced by something softer, almost defeated. Neither of them could deny it. The child they had dismissed as too young to understand had mastered what they could not. He didn't need their shortcuts or strategies. He had learned patience, observation, and the subtle intelligence that comes only with experience. I watched silently, savoring the moment. Every delay, every subtle misstep they had caused themselves, every miscalculation of their own arrogance, it had led here. The system they thought they controlled had flipped, and they could do nothing to change it. They had underestimated the quiet power of legacy, the inevitability of careful planning, and the brilliance of a mind nurtured properly. Ethan looked up, holding the restored bike with pride, and smiled. He didn't need me to narrate the victory. He had experienced it. Daniel opened his mouth, trying to find words, but they faltered. Claire's lips pressed thin. For the first time, neither had a solution, a defense, or a strategy. All their plans had been undone, quietly, methodically, without a fight. I stepped forward, placing a hand gently on Ethan's shoulder. "Sometimes," I said, my voice calm and deliberate, "the most important lessons can't be rushed. They can't be bought, borrowed, or faked. They have to be earned." Daniel swallowed. Claire's gaze dropped. They finally understood, not in anger, but in the deep, sinking clarity of inevitability, that they had misjudged everything. The legacy, the skill, the understanding, they had thought they could erase it, replace it, or ignore it, but none of that had happened. Ethan returned the smile I gave him and went back to his work, perfectly focused. And as I looked at my grandson, the full measure of what had occurred finally settled in. The shop, the knowledge, the patience, and the quiet influence of decades, all of it remained intact. The betrayers had been exposed not through confrontation or drama, but through the unstoppable logic of careful preparation, slow revelation, and inherited wisdom. I turned to Daniel and Clea one last time. No words of anger, no threats, only truth. And then I left the shop, my hand brushing against the familiar metal of the toolbox, and said softly, "Some things aren't outdated, they're unreplaceable." It was all they needed to hear.